All right. Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Tutt, and I'm a program director at Unity Productions Foundation. Very pleased and honored to welcome everyone to today's webinar in collaboration with Susan Douglas, Georgetown University, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the Prince Al Walid bin Talal Center as well, many partners for bringing you a overview on a brand new teaching resource called American Muslim Pathways. This is a really probably in the history of my organization, Unity Productions Foundation, the most important and the most powerful website that we've ever created. This is bringing together the cutting edge scholarship from across the scholarly community, from historians to religious studies scholars to anthropologists to sociologists, a wide ethnic studies, a wide array of scholars have contributed to really bringing forward and filling a gap, frankly, filling a gap in the understanding and the teaching of the history of Islam in America. So we have a very fun and informative webinar for you. We will have a keynote address at 4 p.m., 4:15 p.m. with Dr. Kambiz Ghania Basiri, Carleton College, and we will listen to a brand new podcast that Dr. Kambiz has created on the concept of the mosque. And Susan and I will walk through the website. But before we do all of that, it's my pleasure now to introduce you to Alex Kronemer, my colleague of many years at Unity Productions Foundation. He's the co-founder of UPF. We are a filmmaking group that does outreach, and we also work in Hollywood. And our mission is really to address bigotry, misunderstanding, to promote stronger interfaith relations around understanding Muslim community and the Islamic faith in America. Alex has been doing this for many years. He is an award-winning filmmaker, Emmy-nominated filmmaker, and the project that this is all sort of inspired by, American Muslim Pathways, is actually based on one of Alex's new films that I'm excited to have him tell you a little bit about. So without further ado, Alex, please jump in.
Great. Can I be heard? Yes. Am I muted? No, I'm good. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar for this exciting project. I'm not sure exactly where to start, but let me start first of all by just saying a little bit about the film since Daniel mentioned it. So a few years ago, we made a film called The Great Muslim American Road Trip. And it was a three-part series on PBS. And it followed a Muslim couple, kind of young, telegenic Muslim couple, as they took the historic Route 66 trip from Chicago to Los Angeles, and along the way discovered the many surprising ways in which Muslims have contributed to the culture, the history, the fabric of the country. Almost every stop that they had encounters with different people, Muslims and others who have worked with Muslims, and it was really amazing. To be honest with you, I was obviously part of the film crew, and we took this trip. It was 21 days, by the way, this filming trip, and I imagined that we would find Muslim stories in big cities, but I never imagined that we found so many of these stories in small places. And I always will remember being somewhere in the Southwest on this empty road, like there's nothing, nowhere, anywhere. And all of a sudden in the distance, there's a little mosque off the road. So the Muslim experience in America is long and it's deep. And one of the things that we always think about after we make one of our films is, we're only able to touch on a limited number of topics, limited number of ideas in any film. We just don't have the ability to talk about everything. And so we developed these websites as a way of trying to get at a larger slice of the story. So just as the film, the Great American Muslim Road Trip, revealed Muslim stories along Route 66 that were important, this Pathways website was conceived and I believe has achieved the ability of really showing the broader story of contributions that Muslims have made to America. And I might say unacknowledged contributions, and for many of them unknown. So you'll see more about the website and hear more about it shortly, and it will speak for itself. But the second thing I really wanted to say was how I wanted to say something to all of you as educators, something that's important for you to know, which is, 25 or so years ago, 9/11 happened, and this term that I never heard of really before, first responder, became very much in the lexicon of our language, first responders. And of course, that was really referring to police and firemen. But that idea of first responders came to me not so much from those heroic actions, but came to me from the way educators became first responders in the lives of our children, who were not only traumatized generally by by what happened, but for those of us who had Muslim children, like I do, within a day or two after 9/11, they were experiencing an enormous amount of bullying, uh, of hate speech, even amongst their peers. And I remember there was a science teacher. My son was then in fifth grade or so, maybe fourth grade, and there was a science teacher who, after within the days after 9/11, uh, decided to create quick unit on Muslim contributions to science. And I felt the change that made in my son's life, in his feelings about himself. I saw the change that it made in his peers, and I realized that educators, teachers, are really also first responders to these events that happen. And so I want to say how grateful I am to all of you for taking that role in our society, and how grateful I am that you are joining this webinar to find some of the tools, because we've always been trying to create tools to help teachers do that important job of responding. So I'm very grateful that you're here to learn about what we have created, and hope that you will find it useful and helpful in your work, in your very important work in our schools, but also in our society at large. So thanks.
Wonderful, Alex. Thank you so much. Susan, if you could make me host, because I think that I need to unpin Alex as the presenter. If you could do that and make me the
I
presenter.
can do that right now.
Okay.
There you go.
There we go. Thank you very much. Okay, folks. Well, Alex, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. It's a snow day in the DC area. So perhaps that makes things a little bit easier for you to participate. Perhaps it makes it more difficult. Um, what we want to do is give you a really sort of in-depth overview of why this resource of this new website stands out and is special, and why we feel that it's something that, everybody that does education on Muslims, on Islam, whether in a whole variety of different areas, would really benefit from utilizing this site in your classroom. So let me actually share the website. Susan did put a link to it in the chat. And again, this is really a sort of labor of love. Can you see that, Susan?
Yes.
And everybody?
Yes.
So, American Muslim Pathways discover the history of Muslims in America from their African kingdoms of origin up to today. Presented by leading scholars in the humanities. This is a National Endowment for Humanities sponsored project, which really entails three big domains of activity. First is lectures. And I want to share these lectures. They're all on YouTube. So even, we're going to be doing a lot of like short clips of these lectures, by the way. But these lectures are sort of the heart, frankly, of the scholarship that goes into the main themes. I'm extremely proud of these lectures as the organizer of this campaign. And I want to just give you a feel for the originality of a lot of these talks. So, for example, just as a couple highlighted points, we have a wonderful presentation from Edward Curtis. Edward Curtis is one of the sort of leading historians on the history of Islam in America. And he gave a lecture in Las Vegas on Malcolm X from Mecca to Cairo, where it's a total revisitation of the Cold War dynamics and Malcolm's relationship to both Egypt and Saudi Arabia during the Cold War, and really looking at archival and sort of its original research is the point that I'm trying to make. Another example that I can spotlight here is Dr. Sherman Jackson, who gave a keynote in Washington, D.C., revisiting 20 years later his sort of canon-forming text, Islam and the Black American. And this was, you can see some photos from this, this was sort of a standout event for us. A journey revisited. It was an opportunity to bring together all sorts of different community leaders from the Muslim American community, the African American Muslim community, and examine where Dr. Jackson's main arguments and theses went since he published this book. Another example here is our The Nation's First Mosque by Dr. Sally Howell, which was given in Dearborn. And this is actually about what she often calls the Ford Motor Mosque. And it's about, and some of this is very original in the sense that the State Department has insisted that the first mosque is actually in Iowa. Dr. Sally Howell has a different view. And so she presents this notion that actually it was adjacent to the Ford Motor Plant outside of Dearborn in about the early 1920s, the first purpose-built mosque. And she tells the story of all of the various characters and individuals behind this incredible story. We have a wonderful talk, for example, from Denise Spellberg on Thomas Jefferson's Quran and many others. So those are the lectures. Now, we only have 2 more lectures and the whole project will be completed. We've done just under 15 total talks. All of these can be found on our YouTube page. Some of them are already sort of going viral to some extent, especially Dr. Jackson's lecture, given his gravitas as a scholar. The other element of the website is that we are launching a podcast series. And these podcasts are delivered by the scholars in their voice, and they sort of communicate in a very accessible way, I think, a sort of key motif from their research. So I'll give you just one example, and we are going to look at one of these podcasts and actually listen to it in a little while. This is from Dr. Nathan Lean, who has just finished his dissertation on the origins of Muslim jazz music at Georgetown, actually. And what Dr. Lean unveils here are the sort of pioneers, these sort of the leading figures in the jazz scene, and the reasons behind why so many young pioneers in the jazz scene converted to Islam. And so he tells the story of Talib Ahmad Dawood, and you can sort of get a sense here of the idea behind this. You listen for 15 minutes and you get taken through this photo collage of the different figures. And so you get a visual of the figures that are mentioned in the podcast itself. One additional example that I absolutely love is Sylvain Dayouf's work on how, because as Susan will articulate in a moment, we made a decision to start the whole narrative in West Africa, right? And one of the big contributions that a lot of scholars at Howard University, including Dr. Suleiman Niang, may he rest in peace, and many others, has been the cultural legacy of enslaved Muslims and sort of what has been bequeathed from that legacy. And in this podcast, Sylvain Dayouf takes us through how music has remained a central point of continuity up to the present. And so it's a very, very rich, so folks can learn. And I don't know if you guys can you see the Instagram here, Susan?
Mm-hmm.
So this is one example here I can play for you. This is a little Instagram reel that we did inspired by Dr. Dayouf's thing, and it's actually done pretty well for us. It has over 600 likes, which is pretty good for us.
Practiced by Jolly families or griot for countless generations. Jollies often played the kora, an instrument with 21 strings.
So this is
which
about the
functions
kora,
like both a harp and
right?
a lute. Black musicians all over the world continue to play the kora. Many Muslim American musicians and poets with West African ancestry still identify with being a Jolly or griot today, keeping the tradition alive. To learn more about the history of Muslim American music and culture, visit the American Muslim Pathways website today.
So there you go. So that gives you a sense of some of but we also talk about the banjo, which everyone knows about the banjo, probably not so much the kora. So this podcast would be a wonderful opportunity for students to engage with, and a whole lesson could be formed around this. And we were very clear with our scholars, both in the way that we wrote the main themes, which we'll get to in a moment with Susan, as well as in the way that folks sort of articulated these podcasts, is that we really want this to be for a general audience, not for academic specialists. And I think as you listen to these podcasts, you'll really get that feel of its accessibility. So it's very pertinent and relevant for high school, up through college, right? And it has that sort of evergreen feel to it. So that's the podcast element. Currently, we have 4 podcasts. We are going to be talking about Dr. Cambiz's wonderful podcast based on a new book that he's writing on the concept of the mosque, which we'll get to in a moment. We also have Dr. Howell here. But that's the idea, is that we're sort of bringing brand new scholarship into this historical sweeping arc. And I want now to turn to Dr. Susan Douglas, who probably needs no introduction. Susan has been a longtime advisor to UPF. She was sort of the backbone of helping us piece together and organize a lot of this work on this website. So we're very grateful for Susan's work. And Susan, would you like to become host and share your screen, or would you like me to share and I can share it for you?
I should be you can just stop sharing and then I will share.
Okay, great.
I should have permission already to do it.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
see. Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. And yes, I hope you can, yes, you can see it now. And I really have been so blessed to work with UPF since the beginning. It's been something like 20 some years now, since the very first film, Muhammad Legacy of a Prophet. And so every project is new. And as you educators all know, the fun part of our job is to learn while we're presenting to our students. So here are the 5 themes that I will preview for you. These are the features that really work flexibly in the classroom or community settings. I want to emphasize that, this is also not just something for the classroom, but for many community settings. There are 5 themes: Muslims of early America, the American Muslim Revival, which speaks about post-Civil War conditions, and sort of interfaces with things like the World Parliament of Religions that Russell Webb, who was one of the earliest converts to Islam, were involved in. And so that's a really interesting period that is talking about survivals, but also about about the kind of meeting of immigrants coming in with indigenous Muslims here, or the spread of Islam among people. Then we have building foundations while on the move, the very dynamic period of the 1920s to the 1950s or so, and then a very nice section on the ways in which Islam became an indigenous religion. How did people interpret? And then finally, a sort of summary of American contemporary American Muslim life. So just showing you what that looks like here. You will be able to see, scroll through. This is the last one, so we'll go all the way to the beginning here. And what these feature is are several things. Just jump back to me. There we go. You have a narrative which involves an overview, historical background, and so on. And then you have stories of key figures, and these include a lot of archival photographs, like the whole rest of it does. It's quite amazing. And then a timeline that sort of summarizes it. And then after viewing each of the themes materials, you can actually take a quiz. And yeah, so there's the first one. The next one is here, American Muslim Revival. And again, the archival photographs that are here are very rare. And I can only emphasize from my knowledge of some of the people who have been working in the scholarship, trying to dig up this past out of fragments and bits and pieces, and really dedicated people. So what you have here assembled on this website is really the current state of the scholarship. And lots of dedicated individuals, and looking in archives where you wouldn't expect to find things. And I'm sure many of you already know about the manuscripts, for example, of handwritten bits of Quran from enslaved persons and so on. Okay, so then you have here the period of imperialism and American involvement and sort of peak of the world, making those connections possible. And then you have here the evolution of Islam in America, and then here. So I'll go back to the first one quickly and just take you through the overview. As Daniel mentioned, here it's very easy to go through. You can come in at different ways and navigate to these parts and pieces. But this background, as Daniel mentioned, begins on the background of the slave trade, and it features, and this project, by the way, was funded by the NEH, and so was this one in part, which was the Slave Voyages website, which is the most remarkable thing you can possibly imagine in terms of data on the number of slaves. I show it to my students in my world history classes. I've shown it to people in graduate school, and they are absolutely astounded at the time lapse showing the 35,000 voyages and from which countries they went and where they embarked and disembarked in the New World. So we share some of that information here, some of the images from that project. And then there are some numbers here that come out of really amazing resources like the ship manifests. There's a couple of videos on that thing as well that really begin to provide some solid data. Then we have, of course, the conditions under which people were brought, and how some of them, and this is what where the individuals come in here, of how we've been able to discover remnants of their Islamic practice. One of the most famous ones here from our area here in Washington, D.C., Yaro Mahmoud, the famous Yaro Mahmoud. There is a map at the beginning of each of these sections of the individuals that places them on a map in the order of how they come in. And yeah, and then there's a timeline here, which you can scroll through and go across as it goes down. It's a kind of a funny navigation here. Yeah, it goes down this way. Anyway, you can summarize some of these individuals and put them into their temporal context. So go back now to another one of the ones, which are the final one of the themes, which is contemporary Muslim life, which is really a testament to how Islam has really been made whole in the last 100 years and become part of America. And there are certain markers of that as well, that such as the institutionalization, and it's actually quite a remarkable story. We have background on the demographics of Islam in America today, some quite remarkable statistics from Pew, from the religion census, from various other ones. And we have also highlights from prominent communities. And I will say that this website is also connected to the earlier project that Alex mentioned, which is the Great Muslim American Road Trip. So some of that has been turned into PDFs from, excuse me, into, what am I trying to say? PBS Learning Channel stuff. So they've taken excerpts from that, and you'll be able to access the map of the journey along Route 66 and so on. And so you have really a wide variety of solid research, all of which is documented. We have here the Asian Exclusion Act in all its glory, and what citizenship was granted to people and what not, and it goes on kind of like that all the way through to the most current statistics here, where the mosque studies by Hassan Bagby. We have also the survey of schools here and some samples from some of our Islamic schools, and debunking the ideas that there are hundreds and hundreds of, and they're all madrasas and all this kind of nonsense. In other words, what this website also does is really show that we have solid scholarship documenting this story of Islam in America. And just a few decades ago, it was basically mythology, and it was often tempered by what the Islamophobes had to say about all of this. And so they had commanded the narrative. And I recall another project called Muslims in the American Public Square, where the specific idea of it that has built up some of this ability to do this research was to put down markers in the academic world, to get the scholarship out there. And this website really represents the state of the art when it comes to that. So without further ado, we can show this one of the podcasts, and I will stop sharing and turn you over again to Daniel, who will play a really exciting one of the podcasts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. I just want to quickly share before we do the podcast, just a couple other points. So the American Muslim Revival theme is a very compelling one, and it's a sort of often forgotten period of Islam in America. We're talking after Civil War up through the 1930s. So here we have the great meeting of the Parliament of the World Religions about the turn of the century with Alexander Russell Webb. I think Gandhi also attended the Parliament that year. So this was the post-Reconstruction era. This was the time in which you had all kinds of very interesting European theosophical interactions with Islam. You had Garveyism starting. This is right before the Nation of Islam begins. And so this is a very interesting time period that a lot of new scholarship has been focusing on. So many of our scholars have done a lot of original research in this time period. Here we have a very interesting photograph from Istanbul during the time of the collapse of the Caliphate. And we talk a lot about the immigration patterns after the collapse of the Caliphate. So this is that sort of like late 19th century, early 20th century immigration. And then this is the key figures in American Islam from right after the Civil War up through 1935. Marcus Garvey, number one, just to give you a sense of it, I won't go through everything. Noble Drew Ali is another major figure that we focus on. Dus Muhammad Ali. And all of these biographies were written by and in consultation with scholars like Fatima Fanusi of Howard University, and Susan Douglas was also huge in putting a lot of that together for us. And another great thing about these biographies is if you go here to the timeline, we introduce these seminal figures that really shaped Islam in America through this time period. And once you're done, you can take a quiz to see if you remember And the idea with the quiz is sort of to, and once you're done taking the quiz, you can then share it on social media. So the idea with the quiz is to sort of encourage repeat use amongst users. And then other theme that I'll just mention briefly is sort of, we had this idea, and this is very much reflected in Cambiz's work, of sort of what would it look like to examine the evolution of Islamic institutions, both like as learning centers, as mosques, right? And we begin with sort of breaking down the concept of migration in Islam itself, right? Of hijra. And sort of start from a more abstract theological standpoint and connect it to the various flows of people from around the world from Muslim background coming to the US, right? This is one of my favorites here. This is the Corn Palace. So we have like a whole conversation about the influence of Islamic architecture in America. And then this is a story map, which actually is very, very compelling, done by Patrick Bowen, who has written a wonderful series of books. But this is basically giving an overview of all the predominant types of mosques that you will find in the United States. So students can utilize all of that. And then we also have another timeline as well of the evolution of mosques and Islamic institutions, just to give you a feel for it. So Susan, I think we might want to play the podcast. It's now 4 p.m. Podcast is about 15 minutes, and I think our keynote should be on any moment. Let me first verify that you guys can hear this okay. Okay, so here it is. Can you hear that okay, Susan? Okay, let me stop my share. Susan, you're muted. Thank you, Rashid. Yes, you can. Okay, great. Much obliged. Okay, so I'm going to share this now. Okay. So sit back and enjoy this podcast just to give you a feel for it. And as you listen, I will scroll through these photographs that we've compiled of mosques from around the world.
Welcome to the American Muslim Pathways, a new humanities project on the history of Muslims and Islam in America. Instead of retelling the story of Muslims in America from the perspective of the most iconic or well-known events and people, we focus on the forgotten narratives, the lesser-known biographies, and the surprising events that have come to shape the Muslim experience in America. Our journey begins in the West African kingdom of Mali, where Islam was indigenized in the 1400s. We tell the story of the resilience of enslaved Muslims in America and the resurgence of Islam during the post-Reconstruction period following the Civil War, to the establishment of Muslim institutions across the country in the 1960s to the present, up to the contemporary period, where Islam is not only one of the fastest growing religions in America, but also the most ethnically and racially diverse. You are listening to the American Muslim Pathways Stories series, where we spotlight short and accessible stories on the history of Muslims in America. Each story is read by one of our scholarly advisors. You will hear from historians, anthropologists, scholars of Islam and religion. As you listen to these stories, we invite you to engage the unique webpage dedicated to this story. There you will discover more information, including historical photographs of places and portraits of the individuals discussed, as well as links to further reading and study. In this episode, we hear from Dr. Cambiz Ghana Basiri on the mosque as an Islamic institution. Dr. Ghana Basiri is a professor of religion at Carleton College and the author of the forthcoming book, The Mosque in Islamic History.
Although today most people associate mosques with Islam, the term had been used long before the emergence of Islam to refer to places of divine worship and commemoration. The word mosque is derived from the Arabic word masjid, which literally means a place to prostrate. As early as the 5th century BCE, its Aramaic cognate, miskida, appeared in an oath sworn by the temple in the Jewish Elephantine papyri. It also appeared in the Nabatean inscriptions from the 1st century CE to refer to a commemorative altar built to a deity. The Quran itself uses the word masjid to refer to the shrine built over the dormant bodies of the Christian martyrs from the legend of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. This pre-Islamic history of the mosque is important because it shows that the Prophet Muhammad didn't invent the mosque for his followers to have a place to worship. Rather, the mosque was an existing institution through which he sought to teach his followers the proper worship of God. A case in point is the sacred mosque, or Al-Masjid al-Haram, in Mecca, the most frequently mentioned mosque in the Quran. Arab tribes in pre-Islamic times came to this sacred mosque to pay tribute to their gods and perform sacrifices. While the Quran adamantly opposed polytheism and forbade associating anything with the creator God, Allah, Muhammad and his followers did not contest the sacredness of this mosque. Rather, they acknowledged it as the house of God, built by Abraham and his son Ishmael, whom he bore with his maidservant Hagar. The Quran called for the purification of this existing mosque and called on Muhammad and his followers to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Moses, and Jesus. In fact, shortly after the Prophet Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE, God commanded him to turn his face in the direction of the sacred mosque. This changed the direction of the 5 daily prayers from Jerusalem toward Mecca. Acknowledging the pre-Islamic history of the mosque is also important for understanding the role that religious buildings played in the formation of Islam. When we approach the mosque as an institution that predated Islam, the question of its architectural origins, which has vexed historians of Islamic architecture, becomes less relevant than the question of what constitutes proper behavior in mosques after the Prophet Muhammad and his followers disassociated them from idolatry. This question was all the more urgent in early Islamic history because, as previously mentioned, the Prophet Muhammad did not invent a space for Muslims to pray. Indeed, he is remembered to have said, "The whole of the earth has been made a mosque, except for the graveyard and the bathroom." Hence, early Muslims were not as much concerned about the structure they prayed in as they were about the mosque as a communal space that, as this prophetic saying suggests, meets the requirement for ritual purity stipulated for prayer by Islamic law. Since both dead bodies and excrements are ritually impure, neither a graveyard nor a bathroom can serve as a place of prayer. Other prophetic sayings similarly reveal concerns about community and behavior. In one such saying, it is recounted that the Prophet was performing the morning prayer at the mosque. A man came and prayed 2 prostrations next to the mosque. Then he entered the mosque and joined the Prophet. When the prayer was done, the Prophet greeted him and said, "Hey, so-and-so, which of these 2 prayers are you counting as your actual prayer? The one you did by yourself or your prayer with us?" On another occasion, during the Prophet's expedition to Khaybar, it is reported that he said to his companions that someone who eats garlic should not come to our mosque, presumably because their bad breath would bother fellow worshippers. As these examples of prophetic sayings suggest, the mosque is a communal space for worship. It is not a space deemed sacred by religious officials, nor is it a space sanctioned by a clerical class. The mosque is a functional space dedicated to the practice of congregational prayer. It is a space constituted by the actions of worshippers. If a space meets the requirements that allow for congregational prayer to take place within it, it can become a mosque. This is what has allowed many Muslim minorities in places like the United States to convert warehouses, homes, and even abandoned retail stores into mosques, without the involvement of religious officials. The mosque as a space where ideals of communal life are expressed can also be seen in the injunction that during congregational prayer, Muslims stand shoulder to shoulder, toe to toe. There's no furniture in the prayer spaces of mosques that would allow Muslim worshippers to divide themselves into groups of their own choosing. When the iqama, or the call to rise for prayer, is made, worshippers move around in the open space to form straight lines in rows that begin in front of the Qibla wall, which marks the direction of prayer. They strive to make sure there are no gaps between them as they form these rows. The act of congregational prayer literally embodies the notion of community, or ummah, in Islam, and the mosque provides the structure and space through which this embodiment of the ummah can be experienced locally wherever Muslims reside. As such, the mosque serves as a public space where messages can be communicated to the public and where differences in society can be reproduced or contested. These differences take a variety of forms, including differences in sectarian identity, class, or gender. For example, the Ottomans displayed the names of the first 4 Sunni caliphs in their mosques to highlight their Sunni identity. Similarly, Shi'i mosques sometimes display the names of the descendants of Muhammad, whom they believe were his rightful successors, to highlight their sectarian identity. Another social difference marked in mosque was the special status of those who, because of their religious knowledge or political affiliation, were selected to lead prayers in congregational mosques. Their status in society was emphasized in some mosques by the construction of elaborate minbars from which they gave their sermons. The distinct position of governors and rulers also came to be highlighted by the construction of screened sections in mosques known as maqsuras. These maqsuras did double duty. They protected rulers and their representatives from attacks, but also set them apart from the ruled within the mosque. Neither the minbar nor the maqsura, however, were universally adopted as necessary features of mosques. In fact, since their introduction into mosque spaces, there have always been debates about how religiously appropriate it is to bring such markers of difference in society into this space of the mosque, where the ideal of a community formed purely in relationship to the worship of God ought to be embodied and experienced. Perhaps the most debated and most prominent feature of the mosque that highlights differences within society is the practice of spatially separating the sexes. The strict separation of the sexes in mosques developed over time in Islamic history, and it was never institutionalized in Al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. There, even in today's Saudi Arabia, men and women intermingle as they worship by circumambulating the Kaaba. Nonetheless, the influence of patriarchy in many Muslim societies limited women's access to mosques by either barring their entry or giving them smaller, less welcoming spaces in the mosque. Despite numerous sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that enjoined men to allow women to attend mosques, patriarchal interpretations of Islam did not see the limiting of women's access as an infringement on their divinely ordained duties, because male legal scholars discerned that only free men who have full control over their own bodies are obligated to perform noon Friday prayer in congregation. Women and slaves, depending on the varying interpretations of legal scholars, could pray in congregation with the consent of their male guardians or owners, but were not obligated to do so. In practice, however, Muslim women, even in historically patriarchal societies, did frequent mosques. We know this because of the many sermons and legal writings that admonished them not to attend mosques. Alternatively, in societies where differences in sex were not prominent in social life, we find mosques with adequate spaces for female worshippers, as well as mosques that are exclusively for women. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the mosque as a functional space that fosters particular notions of community and facilitates individual Muslims' obligation to perform prayer in congregation came to stand not only in tension with different understandings of gender relations in society, but it also stood in tension with Muslim rulers' attempt to assert their sovereignty through building programs. If the whole earth can be a mosque, as the Prophet Muhammad had indicated, what was the point of expending labor and wealth on the building of monumental mosques? The historical records suggest that the building of monumental imperial mosques was largely justified by appealing to the Prophet's example. When Muhammad arrived in Medina to serve as a governor among the rival tribes of the city, he built a house with a large courtyard that became the spatial center of the new community he formed between his followers and the tribes residing in Medina. The architecture of this house, which came to be known as Masjid al-Nabi, or the Prophet's Mosque, served as the rudimentary model for the monumental congregational mosques built by Muslim rulers. This house was a rectangular enclosure with a large courtyard. It had a wall with a portico that shaded the Prophet and his companions and also defined the direction of the prayer. One can see the resonances of this building in the vast courtyards and arcaded halls of early congregational mosques such as the Great Mosque of Damascus, or the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, or the Great Mosque of Kairouan. These mosques, in addition to becoming places for communal gathering and congregational prayer, provided a water basin so that worshippers could perform the ablution necessary to enter into a state of ritual purity before facing God in prayer. A prayer niche or a mihrab was also added to a mosque to mark the direction of prayer on a wall and to identify where the imam or prayer leader will stand to lead the congregation in prayer. The adhan, which calls Muslims to prayer, was originally called from the rooftop of mosques. One can still see the ladder inside ancient mosques in Oman that led to the rooftop for the mueddin to call worshippers to the mosque for prayer. The minarets, which we today associate with places from which the call to prayer is made, were most likely originally intended as visual markers and architectural symbols of power that were incorporated into the mosque. For example, the construction of the Great Mosque of Damascus during the reign of the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid retained the towers of the pre-Islamic temenos that became the mosque's outer wall. And later, when he ordered the reconstruction of the mosque for the Prophet in Medina, al-Walid had 4 towers or minarets constructed at each of the corners of the building. These minarets, rather than being a standard feature of Muslim places of worship, were likely intended to visually and architecturally capture the distinctive importance of the Prophet's mosque, which the Umayyads had recently recaptured from a rival claimant to the caliphate, Ibn Zubayr. It was not until the 9th century that minarets came to be a standard feature of congregational mosques, and they were constructed in a variety of forms, ranging from tall cylindrical columns to staircases, to conical or tiered towers, to monumental structures disconnected from mosques, to short towers flanking portals, to enormous square towers, which when captured by Christians in the Middle Ages were converted to bell towers of churches. Like minarets, domes, which are today considered a visual sign of mosques, were not original features of mosque architecture. The first known dome to be associated with Islamic architecture is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. This dome, following the vernacular Christian architecture of the time, was constructed as an outward marker of a special place. In the case of the Dome of the Rock, its dome marked the rock from which the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended through the heavens to meet God. Later incorporation of domes into mosque architecture over the entryway or the mihrab or the maqsura were similarly following this architectural vocabulary of domes as outside markers of special places within buildings. While mosques as places of divine worship and commemoration did not originate with Islam, their association with liturgical practices in Islam are as old as the faith. Presently, as well as historically, one can find mosques wherever Muslims settled. As such, the mosque is perhaps the most central institution of Islam. Mosques can take a variety of architectural and spatial forms, so long as they facilitate the act of congregational prayer. By identifying the direction of prayer, and by being free of ritual impurities, mosques have been adapted to the varying cultural context where Islam has taken root, while simultaneously structuring Muslim acts of worship in these different societies, which today span the globe from East Asia to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, to Central Asia, to the Middle East, to North Africa and Andalusia, to Sub-Saharan Africa, to Western Europe, and to the Americas.
Thank you for listening to Stories as part of the American Muslim Pathways. Please visit MuslimPathways.com to listen to more stories
All right. That was excellent. So I'm very pleased now to welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Kambiz Ghanea-Basiri. Welcome. Let me just read Dr. Ghanea-Basiri's bio for you all. You just heard his wonderful exposition, his podcast on mosques across the world. Dr. Kambiz is professor of religion at Carleton College. He's an internationally recognized scholar in Islam in America and in the Middle East. Dr. Kambiz was named Carnegie Scholar for his book, A History of Islam in America, and he's also been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for his current book project on the mosque in Islamic history. He served as one of 5 national scholars who developed the National Endowment for Humanities and American Library Association's Muslim Journeys bookshelf, which some of you may be familiar with, in part because Dr. Susan Douglas was a huge contributor to that project as well. Kambiz, welcome to our webinar on American Muslim Pathways. We wanted to invite you to say a few things about the podcast that we just listened to. We are currently making a video. So this is like brand new. So we're currently making a video to synchronize all of our images. But that's sort of what I shared those images to give you a sense of the grandeur and the beauty of some of these structures that were mentioned. So welcome to the webinar, and please feel free to take the floor for a few minutes and tell us about your project.
Thank you, Daniel. Can I be heard okay, since I just came in and I'm okay? I'm wonderful. I wasn't sure if everything was set up properly. It's wonderful to join you, and thank you all for your patience listening to that podcast. I wanted to just say a few words about what I was trying to do in it, and which relates to also what I'm trying to do in this book project. The podcast is essentially a summary of the book. This might be one of those first times where like a book has been summarized before it has been completed. And the book project, what I'm trying to do in the podcast, is to highlight some of the ways in which, in this case, the mosque as a way by which the Islamic tradition has given us means by which it has defined itself in various contexts. For those of us who teach about Islam or study Islam, there's been always this question about where is the center of Islam. There's so many different people who consider themselves Muslims. There's enormous diversity in the Islamic tradition. There's historical diversity. Even today, there's an enormous amount of diversity. And in the midst of that diversity and the variety of ways in which Islam has been localized, people have debated, like, so where's the center of Islam? And one of the things that I'm arguing in this podcast and the book is that the Islamic tradition gives us a center through the mosque. And that center is not something that tells us exactly what Islam is, but it gives us a way of seeing how Muslims have expressed themselves, defined themselves in relationship to their historical context, as well as in relationship to other religious communities. And this is important in the sense that what I began the podcast with, that the mosque is not originally an Islamic institution. It's a concept that existed before the rise of Islam, before Prophet Muhammad receives his revelations. And as a place of worship, it was important. For the place itself was important for how the Islamic tradition comes to express itself and define its relationship to other religious traditions. And maybe one concrete example of that is the Masjid al-Haram that I talk about in the early on in the podcast, which is the masjid or the mosque that's most often mentioned in the Quran. This refers to the area of worship around the Kaaba, the sacred precinct or viable precinct around the Kaaba that people visit during the pilgrimage to Mecca. And that space was an important sacred space for people before the Prophet Muhammad receives his revelation. And the Islamic tradition comes to recognize that space as being important in biblical terms, as a house that was established by Abraham and Ishmael, in a way bringing the biblical tradition spatially into relationship with pre-Islamic Arab traditions that existed that saw the Kaaba as a house of idols. And in doing so and reforming that tradition, starts communicating about something about its own message, how it fits into history as both a religion that's tied to the Arabian Peninsula and the history of the people who were there, and also the biblical tradition more generally. And part of what I try to show in both in the podcast and the book that I'm working on is that this role that the mosque spatially plays is something that continues up until the present time, that people continue to through the space of the mosque, through the structuring the space that the mosque is, define their relationship to their context, and also organize themselves in sense of like there are times where women are excluded from prayer areas, other times where they're included, other depending on context and spaces. There are times where men are excluded and mosques only become places for their women's mosques that come to be created. And all of those I'm arguing in the podcast, I'm trying to show in the podcast are part of the ways in which Islamic tradition develops and expresses itself that we could examine by looking at the mosque, not just architecturally, but as an institution in Islamic history. I don't know if that, maybe I could stop there and see if people have questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Cambiz. So I certainly have a few questions myself. I feel like part of what you're trying to do is sort of demystify the concept of the mosque, and maybe for educators on this call, which, you know, we have a great collection of educators, I think both like high school, college level. We also have folks that do education into community level. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the common misnomers that Americans tend to have regarding mosques. I found it very compelling, the point that you made in the beginning of the podcast about authority, and like, why is it that it's actually quite easy for Muslims to make a mosque in a warehouse?
Yeah.
So maybe that is interesting, because that really relates to our mission at Unity Productions to sort of demystify a lot of the taboos and sort of fear that people have about things like a mosque, or, you know, so maybe could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So one of the ways I think people think about the mosque is as this place of indoctrination, or this place through which certain ideals of Islam are disseminated, as opposed to to the public, to the Muslim public. There's this other conception that when you go to the mosque and you see people praying in unison, that people get this sense that, oh, there's like some switch that may go off and all Muslims somehow stop thinking individually and they all start acting together because of what you see happening in the mosque. Of, you know, I always think of the Hollywood movies that are sort of like, you want to mark a space, show that you've entered a Muslim majority society, you hear the call to prayer and you see people bending. So like, you know, it's suggesting that like the mosque makes everyone behave the same way. And it's actually not the case at all, right? That the mosque is is better understood less as a sacred space, if we understand sacred space as a place that is inherently like something has happened there that makes it inherently sacred, or as a place that some official has sacralized so that it becomes sacred. The mosque is much more functional. It's more akin to like a soccer pitch or a football field. It serves a function, and if it allows the game to happen in it, if it allows the prayer to happen in it, it becomes a place of worship, and its task is to become a place in which the worship could occur. If you even think about the person who leads the prayer and at the mosque, that's not an official, right? It's a functionary. You need someone to be in front to pray so that people know when they should bow down together and when they should prostrate to the ground together. So the most learned of the people who are there at the mosque, or usually an respected elder leads the prayer. It's not the imam or the prayer leader doesn't hold a particular office and hasn't been sanctioned to carry out the act because of some education that they have or something of that sort. So that idea that mosques are a place of indoctrination. Mosques are a place in which Muslims put aside their individual thought and like simply absorb information is absolutely incorrect. It's actually a way by which people with very disparate ideas could come together, maybe even disparate theologies could come together, and through the action of their worship, acts of worship, through their action, create a community. And the reason why people need to bow down together and stand next to each other, because it's a place in which they embody a notion of community. They embody the values that they want to see in their community despite their differences, given that there's so much differences among them in terms of how they may think about religion, how they may think about God, and so on, that the action is actually what matters, and that standing next to each other is what matters much more than doctrine or creed or anything of that sort.
That's very powerful. Thank you very much. I want to open the floor for folks to engage with Dr. Kambiz Ghania-Basiri. Perhaps, Susan, you might also kick us off with a question or comment based on what we just heard. Folks can also use the raise the hand feature in Zoom if you wish to jump in and speak to Dr. Kambiz.
I'm going to relay a comment that came in the chat just now, because it is a kind of, it has an interesting history that I'm sure you can speak to. And that is the idea of the Prophet's Mosque as a prototype. And of course, our architectural historians have called this the hypo-style mosque. And so the person is saying, but it was also the Prophet's house. And so she wanted some clarification of how, she said, as she put it, but that doesn't make the mosque a house.
Mm-hmm. If we think about the house and the way in which we think about it today, that's definitely true. But if you actually look at even the earliest biographies of the Prophet, it was very common for houses to have prayer spaces adjacent to them. So you're absolutely right that it's not that the mosque and the house were not the same space exactly. But the idea that that a place of worship would also be completely separate from a place in which one sleeps and eats and so on is also not the case in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. That we have examples of people having the rooms in their houses that they refer to, or adjacent to their houses that they refer to as mosques. In the Prophet's case, the mosque space is much bigger than the living quarters because that's also where the community gathered. So yes, people were not necessarily using the mosque as in the way in which we think about what people do in the house today, but in the 7th century they weren't as separate as the way in which the way we think about a house and a mosque, or a church and a mosque, a church and a house as being completely separate spaces today. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but that the idea of there being a house and a mosque attached to it was not an unusual idea in 7th century Arabia.
Well, building upon that idea, in fact, there were people who, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, actually lived on, the people of the bench, right, who didn't have homes, who came to hear the Prophet, to be near him. So in a sense, they also resided there in a sense. And of course, it was also a place of learning. So maybe you could speak to that part of it.
Yeah, that and there are verses in the Quran that also talk about during the month of Ramadan, don't sleep in the mosque. So the space of the mosque again was not seen as a completely separate space from where people lived and interacted with one another. An example of the people of the bench, from whom we get early Muslim mystical idea, some of whom come to be associated with early ideas of Sufism in the Islamic tradition, is a good example of that. Also, the mosque as a place that people would go to to simply get advice or to rest. And that still happens today. Like, we could go into a mosque and you'll find people sleeping on the floor of the mosque if it's not time for prayer. It's not seen as a space that is sacred beyond it meeting the qualifications of not being impure, ritually impure, for the prayer to be able to take place in there.
Okay, I think we want to open it up to anybody's questions. Don't be shy. Turn on your camera if you want and unmute yourself. You can use the raise hand function so we can get everybody in sequence.
So I see another question today in the chat. I remember it being said that restrooms would not be in a mosque, but I visited and learned of hand and feet washing upon entering. Can you explain? So it's not that restrooms are not found in the mosque. Restrooms are found in mosques. That a restroom cannot serve as a mosque. So it can't be a place in which you pray, right? That graveyards or places in which there are impurities can't be places in which you pray. Well, someone's house or a warehouse could become a place in which one prays. I hope that answered your question. Susan, I didn't also get a chance to say how wonderful it is to see you. It's been a long time.
Thank you. You too, feeling mutual.
Architectural historians brought the idea of the hypostyle mosque, meaning the very basic layout that informed the earliest mosques outside of Medina and then outside of Arabian Peninsula. Yeah. And one of the things about, if I tried to mention in the podcast, is that architectural historians have tried to figure out what the origin of the mosque is through its architectural space. So the idea was that there's this hypostyle mosque that then we see reproduced in other areas. But for the early Muslim community, it actually seemed like what was more important was the action that takes place in the mosque as opposed to the type of behavior that you should have in the mosque as opposed to what it looks architecturally. Of course, the smaller mosques we don't have examples of anymore because most of those don't exist anymore, but have been destroyed over time. That were in these grand sort of imperial types of mosques. But we get from some of the early prophetic sayings, and also people asking questions, all these things about, like, don't come to the mosque if you've eaten garlic, because that would be disturbing to other people in the community. And so it seems like the early issues that Muslims themselves followers of Muhammad themselves were interested in were not architectural issues. They're much more about, like, how we should behave in the mosque. What's an appropriate behavior in the mosque rather than what the structure should look like.
Okay.
We have another question here from Maimuna Ahmed, which says, could you discuss the mosque complexes you see in all the great Ottoman mosques, which served many other functions, like the bazaar, which supported the financial upkeep, the soup kitchen, graves of the founders of the mosque, etc.
Yeah. So the mosques, because of being a place of gathering, have historically had often marketplaces associated with them, and also places to spend time overnight, hotels and places to eat and so on, because there were communal spaces. If you actually read some of, like, when I teach a course called Mosque in Islamic History, we read some travelogues, and they often are all about person stopping at different mosques, even though they're not interested in mosques, but in their journey throughout the Muslim throughout not even Muslim majority society, throughout areas controlled by Muslims, mosques marked different marked the territory, and they became places that this traveler here, I'm thinking of Nasser Khosrow's travelogue in particular, where he stops, and at every stop he talks about going to a mosque or being near a mosque, and gives the name of it because he knows that if there's a mosque, there's a marketplace, and there's a place to stay, and there's a place to get water, because of the requirements of evolution, as well as the fact that it being a gathering place meant that the community comes together and eats and so on. And in the context of the Ottoman mosques, there were a lot of services that are associated with the mosque, and some of those actually also serve as endowments or trusts or waqfs, that then, like businesses that operate and support the upkeep of the mosque. They support both the people who work at the mosque, they support the upkeep of the physical building, and they also provide services for the community more generally. And even today, when you go to Mecca, there's a mall that is right there in Mecca. That's an endowment that supports the sacred precinct or the Masjid al-Haram. This exists in particular. People know these well from the wonderful Ottoman examples that we have. Also, bathhouses and so on existed near mosques, but there are in other places throughout Muslim majority societies.
I put a little question in the chat as well. I don't want to override anybody, so please, overcome whatever. I'm sure that if you have a question, it's very likely that others have the same question or something similar. But I wanted you to mention also the difference between types of mosques, and especially the very famous ones are a certain type of masjid, the Friday mosques or Jama.
Yeah. So there are actually three different often places of worship in a Muslim city or Muslim majority city. One would be often the neighborhood mosques that you may go to for your daily prayers, and that's often referred to as a masjid. And there are more congregational mosques that are called jamas, essentially places of gathering. And for the obligatory Friday noon prayer, that's supposed to be done in congregation, people are supposed to go to those larger mosques. And depending on schools of law, for example, like for the Maliki school of law that's predominant in North Africa and West Africa, a city should not have too many jama mosques, so that people are actually gathering in a single place. So it's okay to have neighborhood mosques, but for the Friday congregational prayer, the idea is that people are coming together to a single place. So yeah, you could see what I was saying about mosques playing this sort of structuring role of actually helping define what a community looks like. And they do so not by describing or theorizing about what a community ought to look like, but much more by through this embodied action of acts of worship. And then there are also these other places that are used for the congregational prayers done at the time of the feasts, the big feast, the one that Eid al-Fitr, that marks the end of Ramadan, and Eid al-Adha, that marks the end of the Hajj season. And those places, people are coming together from like they're supposed to come together from the entire city in one space, and these are often open spaces that people would pray in the United States. People often in cities rent out convention centers, and so everybody comes to that place to do the prayer together. And the idea again there is that through these acts of worship, people come to be come to viscerally understand what a notion of community is, or what a notion what it means to be part of a Muslim community. And it's also interesting to think about the acts of worship that takes place in these places, right? That when you are at the mosque, you're constituting a community that's hearing God's words. In the prayer at the mosque, you're supposed to recite out loud the verses of the Quran, and it's a community being constituted by listening to the verses of the Quran being recited, centralizing those words of God together as a community.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your book and when it's going to come out, how people can access the book, and what you are trying to sort of achieve with your book as well?
Yeah. So this is embarrassing because this is a book that I've been working on for a very long time, and I'm hoping that it would be at the publishers in 2 years and have it to be out in 3 years. It's going to be published by Cambridge University Press. I have a contract with them to finish it, and it's been very difficult to write, largely because as I'm saying, the mosque is such a pervasive aspect of Islam, so that everybody has an experience of it. And often when I start writing about the mosque, people are like, "Why aren't you talking about this mosque that I know?" And, or like this thing that happens that I know. And of course, you can't talk about all of them. And it's taken a long time to be able to get the right register so that people are reading what I have to say as opposed to trying to think about what they already know about a mosque. As a scholar of religion, I thought I was used to this, because when you talk about religion, everybody assumes they know what it is and they want to tell you what it is, as opposed to, like, if you're a medical doctor, they want your expertise and they don't go telling you exactly what you should know. But as a scholar of religion, often people want to tell you what religion is. So I'm used to that, but it's been a little bit unusual in writing this book in terms of being able to get the register right. And the book is going to have essentially four parts to it. The first part is going to talk about the origins of the mosque in early Islamic history. The role is, what we can learn from the ways in which the earliest mosques were used and constructed. And then another chapter is going to deal with the ways in which mosques were built in regions that had religions that are not mentioned in the Quran. So South Asia and West Africa, places where Muslims encountered religions that were not mentioned in the Quran, and how the construction of mosques allows us to understand, in those areas, allows us to understand how they thought about these religions and how they defined themselves spatially vis-a-vis these other religions. And the third chapter deals with the segregation of the sexes in the mosque, and then the fourth chapter and the legal discussions around the segregation of sexes in the mosque, and then the fourth chapter focuses on mosques in the United States, particularly dealing with the issue with which we began, Daniel, about the sort of misconceptions that people have about mosques and the ways we think about public spaces. Often in liberal democracies, we think of public spaces as spaces in which the ideals of a community are expressed. And the example I like to give of this is if anyone has been to Berlin after the unification of East and West Germany, when the parliament was built in Berlin, there was an attempt to make that space of the parliament a particular type of public space that represents liberal democracy of a new country that has been unified and becomes a source of creating unity. And you could take a tour of the parliament, the Bundestag, and when you go, the dome is clear. From the top of the dome, you could see the legislature below. The idea is that there's transparency in the democracy, and you could get these headphones that give you a tour of what you could see outside of the Dome of Berlin. And if you go too fast, the narration of the tour catches up with you. So that the idea is that you're not seeing something that the narrative of a unifying public space does not want you to listen to. So the idea is that public spaces in liberal democracies are spaces through which society is organized. And then you go to a mosque, that's not the case at all. People could be sleeping in it. People are actually going in there, not with a preconception of what a community ought to look like, but and see that idea of community enacted, but people are going in there and learning what a community is through what they actually end up doing in the mosque. And in that sense, it becomes a lot more anarchic. And if we understand anarchic as not something that's like without laws or rules, but we understand as anarchic spaces as spaces that are self-regulating, where people know what they're supposed to do in them and they do them. And that's something that I think a lot of Americans have a hard time understanding, how there could be an alternative ways of creating alternative types of public spaces. And so I tried to talk about the tensions and controversies around building of mosques through showing that type of tension that exists between what people think a religious public space ought to be and what it actually is in the Islamic tradition.
Brilliant. I think we'll do maybe our last question here, which I actually think this is also a very excellent question. We actually have two questions. I apologize. So the first one is, how do you account for the contrast between highly ornamented mosques and then the utterly simple design, say, of the Prophet's original mosque? Is this like kind of is there a parallel like in the Christian tradition between, like the Quaker Meeting House and its minimalism and the, ornate Gothic cathedral and its Baroque? Like, is that like, how do you account for that contrast?
So ornamentation in mosques were actually a contested issue. So in the mosque of the Great Mosque of Damascus, when gold was used, people actually came and ripped off the gold with the idea that these things should not exist in a mosque, that the mosque should be simple. Nonetheless, rulers were concerned about, we actually have a historian saying that he asked his father at one point, why is it that we don't have these fantastic, or why, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but essentially the idea is that he asks like his father, why is it that we don't have fantastic looking mosques like the Christians? Or why do we have these fantastic looking mosques? And the father responds by saying that rulers were worried about people seeing Muslims not having nice places of worship and not converting or leaving the religion. So they built these fantastic mosques as a way of attracting people. So there's no the ornamentation is not a requirement of the mosque, are things that people generally did in imperial mosques or mosques that were associated with government spaces up until the modern period, and they often played a role in marking the territories of an empire. So the fact that Ottoman mosque has a particular type of style meant that wherever you went and you saw that style, you know that you were in Ottoman territory. Or the fact that the Safavid mosque has a particular type of style meant that wherever you went and you saw the ornamentation associated with those mosques as being part of the Safavid Empire or the Safavid territory. But there isn't any sort of theological association with that idea at all, right? So that like the fact that you're going to a particular type of mosque is not associated with any particular type of theology that you have. You go to the mosque because you need to go to the mosque to pray together for the noon Friday prayers, and if the grand ornamented mosque is available, you might go to that one, and if not, you may go to a different one. So it doesn't represent any sort of particular theology in the way like a Quaker Meeting House is representing a particular theology of sorts. Having said that, though, there are ways in which people who ornamented mosques were also communicating something about what paradise may look like and what the divine, being in the presence of the divine may look like, and what divine beauty is like, and so on.
Great. Daniel, I have a thorny question I'd like to raise because we have someone in front of us who's done a lot of research on this subject all over the world, I'm sure. And that is the question that has bugged me for a long time. I'm not aware of mosques anywhere in the world, of the big old traditional ones, that had a separate elevated space for women, or even a separate boxed off place for women. They usually put up some kind of divider, or in some of the mosques in Cairo, they'll put up blankets or something kind of ad hoc for the women. But in the United States, we have not a few mosques that actually have a balcony for women, a raised place. And the only other place I know that these have existed architecturally is in the synagogues.
Mm-hmm.
What have you found on that subject, if anything?
So you're absolutely right that I haven't come across any old mosques that have a raised space for women. There are older mosques that had no space for women, so women could create spaces in them by coming in and separating or being behind men. And often we have people giving sermons against women coming to the mosque, which usually tells us, or sermons preserved that tell us about women should not be coming to the mosque. That tells us women were coming to the mosque into the same spaces that men had come into. The earliest, so the examples that I have seen that exist not just in the United States of the elevated mosque are all newer mosques that exist also in Arab countries. I have seen them, and the justification often given for those is that even I was in South Africa, there too there were elevated older 19th century, not that old, but again, modern 19th century buildings that had an elevated space for women. And the example that's often given for that is the hadith that says paradise is at the feet of women. And so this was a way of both separating the sexes, but also honoring women, to say that,
I've never heard that one.
Yeah, so that's the one that often I have heard people say, that there's a hadith that says paradise is at the feet of mothers, and so women are above men but separated and that was seen as a way in the modern era to both elevate the status, honor women, and maintain the separation of the sexes, which historically was a patriarchal practice.
Right. I know one situation in which the women actually ran out of space in their little balcony, and they then occupied part of the floor of the main mosque. You know, they look, guys, we've got the kids up here too, so you know, it's not in a room. I do want to recognize someone who's here is Brenda Randolph, who is Education Outreach Director at the Howard University Center for African Studies, who wants to alert you to a wonderful related resource on this subject. So, Brenda?
Well, thank you. Thank you for recognizing me. This has been a wonderful webinar. I really enjoyed it. I've learned so much. With regard to the mosque, I just wanted to highlight a resource that we have at Howard, our Center for African Studies, which is the Gold Road, in which we highlight early West African mosque. And we have an activity for students when they can make the mosque speak, or basically, you know, tell what the mosque is like. This is an activity that we did recently at the National Council on Social Studies. In reference to earlier mention of early West African Muslims in America, we have a publication called Book 2, which is this publication, which is named for the woman that they said founded the city of Timbuktu, which is named for her. And in it, there is an article on early West African Muslims by Sylviane Diouf. I think that you'll find that very informative. We love Sylviane. She's been so much a big help to us in providing this information. And also that issue has information also on early, the voices, we have a role play on the website called Voices of Early West African Muslims, in which you can call them profiles instead of role plays, if that's better. And students get to talk about that particular person. It's an activity in the classroom. So we like to do lots of different things to bring this to life for students. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda.
All right, Brenda, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kenia Basiri. Thank you so much. This was extremely insightful. We hope the book comes out as soon as possible. The podcast will be a good resource before it comes out. And I just want to say, for folks that want to practically bring the American Muslim Pathways resources to your classroom, Dr. Cambiz's podcast is one great way to do that if you're interested in sort of doing a lesson on mosques. But we also have the story map, and we have that theme number 3 that I kind of scrolled through and gave you the overview, which really gets into sort of the concept and the historical evolution of the institution of Muslim institutions. So it takes a much kind of more bird's eye perspective on that. And Susan was instrumental in helping us create that. I want to thank Susan and Georgetown University for their support in this. I want to turn it over to Susan, but before I turn it over to Susan, I just want to say we are ending a little bit earlier than we intended, but we have a request, if it's okay. Since all of you are educators and engaged in this topic area, we've just launched this website very recently, and we have a form that we'd like for you to fill out. Should take about 5 minutes. It's like a feedback form, and we want to hear your thoughts on the site, how you might use it, and in particular, if you might have any thoughts about reviewing the website so that we can really promote it and really get the word out amongst the wider educational community. And so if you have any ideas, we're also willing to offer, we're interested in talking to folks that might be interested in actually helping us promote it as well. So you can indicate that in the feedback form as well. I'll put a link to it here in the chat for folks. So there it is. And we'd love for you to sort of stick with us on the call while you do the feedback form. If that's okay, that would be our preference. Thank you, Brenda, for sharing that. And Brenda, let's follow up as well to ensure that we link to that wonderful resource on our On Pathways, and then vice versa as well. So Susan, maybe you could say a final word, and then we'll invite folks to do the feedback.
I'm just muted. The thing I would really like to get from some of you who have listened to this podcast, we could, I know we do have some time, we have scheduled this until 5:30, but I wonder if you would like to maybe give me some thumbs up or so, if you would like to have a few minutes to actually go on the website and get into some breakout groups, maybe 2 or 3 of them with the number of folks here, and just explore the website on your own, or just in maybe 5-minute session, either 5 or 10, whichever you like, and then talk with each other and share with us what you would like, how you envision making use of this in your work, whether your work is in the classroom or whether your work is within community gatherings of different kinds. So, all right, so I see 1 thumbs up to make a couple of groups. I know it's always very profitable for us and for you when you are able to meet together with your colleagues. So what I will do is I will just make random, what do you think, Daniel, 2 groups?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great idea, Susan. We do have some extra time.
Okay, that's good.
Again, before you
I'm
do
going
that, if I say goodbye.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Kambiz. It's great to see you.
Likewise.
And I'm sure
Thank
you
we'll
so much.
cross paths again.
Yes,
So,
thank you for having me.
Thank you,
great.
Kambiz.
I, for some reason, do not see on my screen here breakout groups. Perhaps I will turn host over
I just
to
wanted to
you.
say one thing about
Mhm.
Maimuna says, hopefully I pronounced your name correctly, regarding Hispanic and Latino influences on Islam. We have a scholar that gave a lecture on that theme, and I'm going to share the YouTube playlist of these lectures. It's my personal favorite part of the whole Pathways project, just because I love scholarly lectures, and so they're kind of like podcasts. You know, I like to listen to lectures on YouTube a lot, and one of the scholars gave this incredible lecture at UCLA, actually, and it's on Latino and Islamic cultural connections. I'm going to share the link with you now, and Dr. Miriam Sada, and she did her dissertation on in Mexico City, okay, on this precise theme that you're talking about. So sorry, I am linking to it now. Sorry, Susan, please go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You just want to put the link in the
I
chat, or
put
you
the
want to
link in
go
there.
to
Yeah,
it?
we can do the
Okay,
breakouts.
Well, what I'm seeing at the screen, since this was your meeting, I believe, I don't see a breakout capability down here on the bottom. It should be this sort of waffle, and there's no waffle there. And many of you teachers know, so if you're seeing it, but I don't see it as part of this meeting. So perhaps we can, instead of going in breakout groups, we can simply, and I looked into more and I looked all around the screen and I don't see it. So perhaps if you could, some of you could just share what you think about it, what you what ideas you've generated for using it in the different professional applications that you're part of. I don't know, Chris, what do you think to kick us off?
Yes, it looks wonderful. Of course, I always enjoy UPF and all the resources. It's always top notch. And the way I'm envisioning it right now is, I mean, it's I think, pretty well designed in terms of creating an assignment for students to explore, maybe like you could put it into a U.S. history class. Or in a standalone religion class, potentially you could look at it in terms of lived religions. Yeah, I'm looking forward. I'm just playing on it with it right now in terms of using it as a complement to a lot of the UPF videos I typically show in the classroom, as kind of an extension to that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Anybody else?
I would like to share. I mean, as I'm an educator really for adults, and right now with DEI being stigmatized in the field that I am focused on as an interculturalist, I want to really put this out on my LinkedIn profile, and right now I'm saying to get ahead, because right now the microscope might not be on Muslims and on Islam, but it could be. And I want to educate and inform. And I think right now that there are organizations, corporations that are looking for incredible, valuable, vital tools. This is top notch. I am blown away. I am moved, and it's exceptional. And I congratulate you, Daniel, and Susan, and UPF. It's the first time for me to see it, even though Alex Cronemer is my husband. So,
Wow, Libby, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful comment. Thank you to Mary Gray. Mary, I think you're going to enjoy the podcasts. I would recommend that we have 2 on music, one from Sylvain Diouf, and then one on jazz from Nathan Lean. So that is very rich. And there's a whole module on hip hop, Muslim hip hop artists, which is really good for younger students. So that could be like a whole module. So part of the part of the good thing with this is, like, there's so much that can be used that we want you to think about it kind of like a piecemeal. You can sort of pick and choose all of these, like, think about it very modular, and then Mary asks, may we contact the specialists if there's questions? Yes, you can contact the specialists. I suppose that would be Susan and myself. If you wanted to invite one of the scholars to give a presentation, that also might be possible. I mean, I'm not guaranteed, but that's possible. Some cases they're quite busy, but that's possible. But we'll be sharing a lot of short clips from these lectures. I'll give you an example of one thing we're doing. And next month during Ramadan, we're going down to Charleston, South Carolina at the brand new International Museum of African Culture. Literally, I think it's just a few years old now, for a keynote on the Gulagachi people. And the Gulagachi people are like one of the oldest indigenous Muslim communities from West Africa, that sort of still have a presence in the Georgia Sea Islands, in the South, in South Carolina. And there's a scholar who hails from that community, um, named Muhammad Fraser Rahim, and he's going to give a keynote basically about his brand new book on the legacy of the Gulagachi. And we will be doing some interviews with various members of that community as well. So that's like another example of additional resources that connects also to what Brenda was saying about West Africa. So much rich material here that can be used.
Said?
Please.
I saw you unmute. Said, did you want to speak to something?
Aisha says that she used our film, Nadia's Ramadan, a short film about Ramadan, at a iftar. It was well received. That's great to hear that. Thank you.
I want to speak to sort of, if someone has some response to this, perhaps, that one of the really amazing functions of this project is to, for Muslims as well, to knit together the two components of the American Muslim community. One of those being indigenous Muslims, Black Muslims for the most part, and those who came as immigrants. And there's a third segment which is growing very rapidly, and that is Latino, Hispanic, people of Hispanic heritage, where there's a particularly interesting connection because the Spanish, when they discovered the New World after 1492, wanted to keep Muslims and Jews out of it. And recently, I think it was Spain or Portugal, was it, who spoke to this exclusion of Jews and wanted to apologize or something of that nature. But anyway, what I really wanted to say about this site is that there have been some misunderstandings or kind of a gulf between the immigrant Muslims from all over the world and the indigenous Muslims who were already here, and particularly through the Black experience. And this website really does a lot. This whole project with the lectures and the podcasts and all of the stuff you have there to knit this together. Also in understanding that, you know, what it has taken over the decades to create understanding between the two and more collaboration. So I wonder if anyone here in the room has anything they'd like to speak to about how they see that sort of issue, and as a need also in education, because you're going to have in your classroom sometimes people from both of the sides of this. I guess it's the end of a long day, huh?
That's a tough question, Susan, I must confess. But
But
I
it's
do
so
wanna-
important. It has taken literally decades,
Right,
you know.
right.
And Sherman Jackson had a lot to say about that after 9/11, you know, about the whole issue. And then things like the highlighting of this issue of whether someone, like, how do you classify people from the Middle East? Legally speaking, they wouldn't be allowed to be citizens unless they could be classified as white. And that story is here on the website. Kind of astonishing. That's one that students really need to understand. Who could be a naturalized citizen and how those people couldn't. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was mentioned in the lecture as well. But it's quite an issue.
Yeah, that's very important. I just I put another link to the feedback form and just remind folks to help us just take a few minutes. Please fill it out. Thank you for those of you that have already filled it out.
You wanted
And
to also ask for reviewers, teachers who are
yes,
willing to review the site, Daniel.
yes. one of the things we're looking to do is identify folks that might be willing to write a review of the site. We actually at UPF have just expanded our social media team. As you saw in that Instagram example, uh, it got like 400,000 views, which is really good for us. And so what we want to do is sort of roll out a bunch of this content on social media. And one way to sort of supplement that would be having educators like you guys really helping to sort of say, hey, this is worth checking out. This is worth your time. Got to bring this to your classroom. And so if folks are interested in that, we'd love for your review. Critical as well could be welcome.
Yes.
We're not asking for like a soft review. I mean, a critical review is also very welcome. Although I must say, it's going to be tough to be critical because we do have the best scholars in the field. And the fact checking was immense. I mean, that was the most painstaking part of the whole project, to just work with scholars on each point raised, every footnote, every citation, to sort of translate it from academic language into a public vernacular, right? And make sure that it's all very factual and accurate. It required quite a lot of eyes and a lot of review. So we would love your review of the site.
In exchange for, also, what do they get?
Well, yeah, if there's interest in that, we also have Amazon gift cards that we're going to be offering to folks that are going to help us promote the website as well. So that's something. At the last question in the feedback form, if you press yes, I'll be sharing more information about that as well.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for including me.
Yeah, we'll give folks a couple more minutes. I'm giving my email down here too, if you have any direct questions for me. Yeah, one of the things that, we're going to be doing is we're launching a brand new film on the concept of love in Islam, the meaning of love, both in Islamic literature, but also in the Quran and in the sort of the core of the tradition. And that's going to be a PBS film coming out this summer. So this project has sort of just launched. And what we want to do is, like, Susan and I have created these websites around our films that have literally, they are evergreen, Susan. Like, Prince Among Slaves right now, it's another film we did, and it has an educational website and a series of curriculum that is used every year by a few hundreds, maybe more, classrooms. So it sort of has a shelf life that's it's not like a one-off. It's kind of evergreen. So we want this to be the same. We want this to be the same. And the fact that the scholarship is so current, that I think means it will have a long shelf life as well.
And at many levels, and not just for the classroom, not just for secondary, but, parts and pieces of it can be used, in even elementary and certainly for community outreach. So are you seeing action on the forum?
Yes, we're seeing some action. Thank you all.
We appreciate it.
We appreciate it, and I'll send out a reminder as well.
Also, any comments that those of you who agree to review it in exchange for a nice gift
Yeah.
would be, to speak to the navigation of the site, the ease of navigation, things of that nature is also very important.
Yeah, we'll give folks just a couple more minutes. There really is some great stuff on here. I think, Wallah Kowesi has a wonderful lecture that you can check out from I'll share the playlist of the lectures here if I haven't shared it already. Hers is about like contemporary Muslim theological leadership and the generational contrast and difference between like the new Zoomer and millennial generation and how they are relating to more established theological authorities. That's a very rich and very interesting talk. As I already mentioned, Dr. Sherman Jackson. We have a wonderful talk from Michael Gomez, which is of the history of like pre-transatlantic slave trade, the Malian Kingdom of West Africa. And what's nice about it is it's a very visual focus. It's all of these maps of Timbuktu, as Brenda mentioned, Timbuktu. And so it's a very, very rich, very ancient, it's kind of ancient history lecture. Patrick Bowen has a great talk on ethnic diversity in the contemporary Muslim community. And I already mentioned the Miriam Sada on Mexican and Latino connections. So there's a lot there. Sherwin says, are there particular parts of the website that would be well suited for lower elementary 2 to 4? Okay. So what do you think about that, Susan?
What I think is that there's two of those things. One of them is the music. And you know, I think there's samples of the music on the podcast as well, and in the lectures. And also particularly in the section that I worked on in the first theme, which is the early American, you have the story maps of these individuals who, some of whom are quite familiar already. Yaro Mahmoud, Abdurrahman ibn Suri, the prince who's prince. And there are probably 10 or 15 of those people whose stories somehow survived, some artifacts even from their lives somehow survived through slavery and the partly oral histories, but also biographies that were written of some of them, like Omar bin Said, where it was learned that they were literate somehow in Arabic and English, so they've, got writings. So these are small things, images that you could use. One of the things that was remarkable was one of the figures by name of Nicholas Said, who has an amazing story of being carried across the desert and of ending up fighting in the American Civil War. And I actually found a document from his regiment that had his name like listed right there. So these kinds of amazing little glimpses that you can get from the past, people who were written about because they were extraordinary or because they were very resourceful people who communicated, their needs and so on, or who stood up for their right to pray or something like that. So those are stories that can be pulled out and can just, with an image and then the short bio that you'd be able to interpret for them. I think a fourth grader already could read them easily, or pretty easily. But those I think are the real heart of it. And so you have these vignettes about people that are throughout the site in the story maps section.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Hopefully that is helpful for you, Sherwin. I would completely agree with that. I think that yes. Yeah, I totally agree with Susan. That's great. And that's really what the website's meant to be. It's meant to be a public resource that sort of spans public learning, public humanities, public engagement, but really can also fit nicely in the classroom. So we really hope that you all use this, that you get the word out, help us get the word out. Thank you for those who have submitted the feedback form. We greatly appreciate that. I'll send an email reminder if you're too tired to do it now. That's no worries. Would love for you to do it in the next, day or two. And I think, Susan, we'll wrap up.
Sure.
And, stay in touch. Please reach out with any questions or thoughts. Follow us on social media to get some new snippets of the Pathways website, which we'll be releasing very shortly.
Okay, and now everybody got to turn to dinner time, and hopefully you're not commuting in this mess. But we really appreciate your having joined us after your long day of work already.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Libby.
Thank
Have
you
a great night. Thank
Good night.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Susan. See you, Daniel.
Great to see you, Chris.
Likewise. Take care.
Bye. Thank you, Sherwin.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Unbelievable, Susan.
Alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
Wait till we start working on the one about love, the love stories. That's going to be something, huh? Okay, good night.